My name is Monk Rowe for the Phileas Jazz Archive. Very pleased to have Loren Schoenberg here today. And I read through your resume. It only took a half an hour.
Ba-dum-bum.
Ba-dum-bum is right. But all the things you've done, I don't like to bring myself into this, but I can personally relate to it because I've done a few of them, and I know they have required different talents. You started out playing the piano, right? Did you have a point in your teens where you said to yourself, damn it, I'm going to be a musician. I'm going to make a living as a musician?
Well, I don't know how to say it. It was almost like preordained or natural for me that this happened. I'm the youngest of 3 children. And sometimes I think the youngest child, they say, is spoiled or has more options because maybe the parents had other experiences with the older children or something like that. So I evinced a talent for music early on. Not a great talent, but just I loved to play, and I was always playing. And my high school band director had been a music theory major at Manhattan School of Music. And I really kind of cottoned to music theory for whatever reason. Maybe because he was a great teacher in high school. And we had music theory. This is amazing. I mean, this was a normal high school. This was not an art school. It was just Fair Lawn High School in Bergen County, New Jersey. And somehow the career that my band director had of becoming a music theory major, he had gone to Manhattan School of Music. Somehow I kind of fell into that was going to become my goal. And then there were no jazz degrees in those days, not really jazz programs, so to speak. Juilliard had no jazz whatsoever. And Manhattan School of Music did have a good jazz band led by Rusty Dedrick and a good faculty. And so I wound up being accepted to Manhattan School of Music. I guess we're jumping ahead a little bit here, but I wound up being accepted there in 1976 as a theory major and piano minor. But the funny thing was that my parents were very supportive. I never even contemplated doing anything else. And they let me do that. It wasn't as though, there was a kid lived down the street from me, Harry Ballin, much more talented than I am, played Brahms and played the wonderful piano, and he was a year younger than me, than I. And so, but his parents made him get a law degree. And I think that was probably how it was for most kids, but it wasn't like that for me.
Yeah. They want you to have even if you go into music, some of them want you to have the fall back on.
Right.
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 Get that teaching degree or whatever.
Right. So that was a real leap of faith of my parents. I guess, I was very lucky with my parents, which I can tell you more about.
Did you, were you turned on by the swing era music and then the jazz that was being played at the time?
No, it's all because of my father had 78, a Decca 78 album of the Jolson story, with 2 pictures of white gloves on the cover, no picture of Jolson or anything like that. And I fell in love with his voice and phrasing. I was a strange kid. I mean, I'm 4 years old. This is 1962, and I loved these records. And I used to imitate them. It was kind of strange for a little kid. And that got me into, I was already kind of like, I should tie up the Jolson thread just for a moment. That the whole thing about minstrelsy and African American culture actually wound up getting a head start by being attracted to Al Jolson and then eventually having to come to terms with minstrelsy in general, Jolson in specific, who's gotten a very rough deal. He's become kind of like the straw man for talking about minstrelsy, which is very unfair to him. But so unwittingly, I was set into something that was going to force me to confront, the overwhelming issue of America, and as W.E.B. Du Bois put it, so many years ago, race. So that pretty much everything I've done in my life has in some sense, been connected with those questions. But I went from there. I was a collector. I used to write NASA and get things about Gemini 6 and Gemini and the little home film of the docking and all this kind of stuff. So I was that kind of kid who would write letters and wanted to research things for whatever. And then because I wanted to see Al Jolson, and then eventually I wanted to see old movies, and I wanted to see old Warner Brothers films. There were theaters in New York City, like the Theater 80 St. Mark's and others, that this would be the early 70s, that were showing old movies. And my parents, God bless them, would bring me in from the suburbs and watch these old movies, which they weren't particularly interested in. They had seen them when they came out, and they weren't at all interested in nostalgia or anything like that. And then I started seeing Ruby Keeler and Dick Powell and those movies, and I kind of loved that stuff, and I was already buying records in the local public library. And then eventually lucked up upon Hollywood Hotel, which had Benny Goodman's band in it.
Oh.
And then all of a sudden I got this bug about, oh boy, well, all that other stuff was great, but boy, there's something about that really gets me. Well, my local public library had a copy of Benny Goodman's 1938 Carnegie Hall concert, double LP, which influenced so many people of a certain age. And I fell in love with it, and I just loved listening to it. And at that point, I started piano lessons when I was 4. And, a typical thing, an old lady who lived on my little street, who had like a living room with like heavy drapes. I mean, it was your typical, whatever that experience was. You felt like everyone was looking at you, and you sat there and you played, and the dark drapes and the old lady and the whole thing. But it worked well, you know what I mean? Not interested in jazz at all or anything like that. But I learned the hand, whatever the heck it was.
Hand exercise.
Right, and John Thompson, a day in Bermuda or whatever they called it, a snowy bird, and learned all that stuff. And then on this Benny Goodman record, I listened to it, and I looked at all the names. And then in my local newspaper, the Bergen Evening Record, I was about, 13 or 14, and it said, Sundays at the Colonial Post on Main Street in Hackensack, New Jersey, Sundays maybe 5 to 8 p.m., Teddy Wilson. And I said, this cannot be the Teddy Wilson who's on the Benny Goodman record I'm listening to at Carnegie Hall. I mean, what would he be doing playing at an Italian restaurant in Hackensack, New Jersey? Well, it turns out that Teddy lived in New Jersey, as did Hank Jones, in Bergen County. And when he was around, he took whatever gigs he could get just to keep his fingers in shape, and maybe he was in between tours or whatever. And so my parents took me to see him, and he was very kind and let me sit by the piano and look and all this kind of stuff. I mean, I really had no inkling of what I was getting. I mean, I knew he was great, but I didn't know. All I knew was this one record and that I loved the music. And so my parents got to meet him, and that started a series of things where my parents would meet these musicians. Now, let's put it in context. I mean, these are African-American musicians. I'm a kid growing up in the 60s and 70s in Bergen County, New Jersey, which was one of the most undiverse places that could be. Although my town, called Fairlawn, was kind of unusual because it had a large Jewish population. On the day that my parents moved in the 1950s to welcome the first Jewish family on the block, everyone put up for sale signs in all the houses. So they saw that as they drove up the first day. Then they took the signs down. So, it was not a very diverse place. So what happened was my parents met Teddy Wilson and eventually met Hank Jones and eventually met Eddie Durham and a few other people who were so avuncular and so warm and supportive. My parents said, well, we have no problem at all with our kid leaving them in these hands. Now, if you had said to my parents, your son's going to be a jazz musician and he's going to be hanging out with these people with all the prejudices about, forget race for a moment, just about how jazz musicians are. I mean, my parents were just normal. When I say normal people, what I mean is they didn't know anything about showbiz or musicians.
He's going to work in bars and live the nightlife.
Well, plus, and all the negative connotations that, again, due to race, that came to, as we find out that more, physicians have problems with drugs than musicians, and that, musicians are actually way down on the line. But anyway, so you asked earlier about like when I knew I was going to be a musician. I think all these experiences kind of led to that. My parents saw like, oh wow, there's these wonderful mentors out there and they're willing to answer Loren's questions or something like that. And so that's kind of part of the context.
That's terrific.
Thanks.
You mentioned the minstrel practice.
Minstrelsy.
Minstrelsy, thank you.
Right. Still very prevalent in 2019.
This is
It is.
this is maybe a hard or way too simplistic question. But you teach jazz history. Do you think that the development of the music has more to do with sociology or to do with musicology?
Oh, sociology.
Okay.
Hands down.
Okay.
Because I mean, I'm a college dropout, so let's get that started. So in other words, I don't know a lot of terms to be conversant with necessarily, and I might be confusing some that someone with a real academic background might hear me talking like right now they're rolling their eyes. But what I mean is that, well, you mentioned teaching jazz history. We don't get to Jelly Roll Morton or Sidney Bechet for a couple of months. So, it's all about New Orleans and English and French mercantilism and what it was like to be colonized by the French or by the English or by the Spanish, and about, of course, New Orleans, and about the great lies of the 19th century, and about Gottschalk, Louis Moreau Gottschalk, and about Abe Lincoln and all these things, and without laying a strong predicate or whatever the right word would be for that, then I don't think you can really start to understand. I should say not you, of course, but a young student of 2019 who may not be enmeshed in history like earlier generations were. Mm-hmm. That it's necessary to create this context, and then maybe we can start to understand who Armstrong was and who Bechet was and who Benny Goodman was and all these things. So about minstrelsy, I learned a lot from reading Albert Murray and then getting to know him and Stanley Crouch and others, and just doing a lot of reading and talking to people, including musicians of the much older generations. I mean, I got to know Zutty Singleton's wife pretty well, which I'll talk about when we talk about the New York Jazz Museum, and trying to put it all together in some way that makes sense. So, I don't know if that answered your question, but...
Okay. You just returned from the Jazz Ed conference?
Jazz education,
yeah, the Jazz Network
yes.
thing in Reno.
Yeah, it was great.
Now, when you're out there and being surrounded by all those people and activity, you might get one feeling about the state of jazz. When you come back here and you live here and you participate and you observe the jazz scene, do you get a different take on today's state of jazz?
Well, I wouldn't say I get two different ones. They're all part of one. Mm-hmm. It's like, not mirror images, but it's so inspiring going to those jazz conventions. I mean, it's just wonderful because you see what the music means to so many people who don't live in New York or don't live near the major metropolitan areas where there are jazz clubs. And these are the people who are keeping the flame alive and everywhere else in the country. And to see how the kids are so excited and, all this kind of stuff, and they're going to play their tune and they're going to do this and they're going to do that without realizing, and this kind of merges a little bit with your previous question, merging with American history. Every time you pick up an instrument to play jazz or to contemplate it, you're part of some tradition. You're following in footsteps, defined by African American geniuses. And you're part of a story. And it's a great heritage, and it's a heritage that, it's participated in by something that is, for the most of the time, fun, playing an instrument, mm-hmm. And tapping your foot. And so it's kind of profound. I mean, it's easy to look at jazz education or things like that less than charitably sometimes, when you realize that, a large percentage of people who teach either never played in a band or never really had experience. I don't find that very satisfying at the end of the day as a as the proper, not the proper way, but as how I look at it. I look at it, it's all good. This is wonderful. These are people who love the music. We got to support them and get to them however we can get to them. And a big problem with teaching, as I'm sure you know and we all know, or as parents know, I'm not a parent, but that you can't teach kids in 2019 assuming that they're like we were in 1976 or 1986, or as your students were in 96 or '06. It doesn't work. And so consequently, you've got to learn to adapt. And
Really?
so that's how I come back from the Gen Convention in Reno. I heard some great music. I met some wonderful teachers. I made old friends. I met old friends. I made new friends. And I was just really pumped up just to see all these people loving it. And I come back to New York, and of course I'm very involved with the Jazz Museum and keeping an institution alive. And so yeah, it's all part of one big picture. I don't have
It's all good.
a summation kind of thing. But I'm just going back to something I wanted to say was I'm probably the luckiest person. Some people say, well, luck, but there's also, this and that, and being in the position to have luck or something like that. Nonetheless,
Okay.
I am among the luckiest people that you're ever going to interview.
All right. I consider myself pretty lucky too, and I at one point I had because I was in the right place at the right time, I got to ride to a gig with the statesman of jazz, and like Milt Hinton was on my left, and he fell asleep on my shoulder, and I'm thinking, this is Milt Hinton, and I'm with him, and Panama Francis is in Claude Williams, and I'm just like, said to myself, you should really take note of this and
Yes.
appreciate it.
Yes.
So I'm wondering if you had that same feeling, and you played beside, Eddie Durham and Panama I mentioned, and Russell Procope, and were you aware of the significance of that, I guess, if I have a question?
To the degree that a 19-year-old can, or
Right.
a 25-year-old, yeah. I mean, if you want to work biographically up to how all those things happen. So I'm back in New Jersey, and I'm a teenager, and my parents are meeting some of these people, and I'm hearing Teddy Wilson, and then Hank Jones also was playing solo piano at a place called the Sherry Netherlands, and I used to go there. My parents would leave me, and Hank would drive me home. Was I appreciating it as to what it really was? How could I? I was 16 years old. I knew that this was a great man and that I was very lucky to be around him. Now I look back at it and I'm like, Jesus. But what happened was there was something in New York called the New York Jazz Museum. How I learned about it, I don't remember, except I would have read about it in the paper. This is 1972. So I was 14 or turning 14 that summer. And I don't know how it happened. I guess I read about it, asked my parents to take me in. They took me in, and I wanted to volunteer. And I wound up becoming a volunteer at this place. As it opened, it was on West 55th Street, between 6th and 7th, right just east of the city center. And it was in an old carriage house that had been owned by the Rockefellers many, many years before. And there was a woman named Evelyn Cunningham, who's a real figure in New York civil rights history, who worked for Nelson Rockefeller. And somehow, between her and some other people, they arranged for this to become a jazz museum. It was just it's kind of like the shape of our place up in Harlem now, kind of a long, rectangular kind of space, not that big, but it went back pretty deep. And the man ran it named Jack Bradley. And Jack, this is 1972, Louis Armstrong died in 71. Jack was a photographer and a guy who he was good friends with Bobby Hackett, and he was like an adopted son of Louis Armstrong's, and a lifelong disciple of his. And he wound up becoming the manager of this small little jazz museum. And he took me on as a volunteer. So every Saturday and Sunday, I would take the bus. You could take a bus from suburban New Jersey into New York. It was easy. And my parents let me do it. Unbelievable. And I wound up volunteering there for years. And this is where I got to know Marge Singleton, Zutty Singleton's wife. It's where I got to know Clarence Armstrong, who was Louis Armstrong's, I guess he was a cousin. He was mentally challenged. In those days, they used the word slow or retarded. I don't know what the right term is. But he was kind of like a big child. And because Jack was so close with Louis and the family, he would spend weekends there. A little bit later, Duke Ellington was, we didn't know, but he was dying in the hospital. So Harry Carney came in, and Harold Ashby used to come in and spend weekends just hanging around this jazz museum. So I got to know all these people. There was an opening of an exhibit on Count Basie. And I bought my little, at that time I had a handheld cassette machine that was, about this big. You remember that you press the button like this.
Yeah.
And I remember bringing it in, and I tape recorded on a cassette the opening night, and it was Eddie Durham, Buddy Tate, Al Gray, Chuck Folds on piano, Eddie Jones on bass, and Joe Jones on drums, and a few others who I got to know later. Paul Quinochet was there. And then, who comes in but Basie? So Basie plays the piano. Then who muscles his way through the crowd? Now, Eddie Jones, if you remember, I think you interviewed him. Did you interview him?
Not the bassist.
Not the bassist. No. Eddie Jones was about 6 feet. He could have been a football player, like 6'6", big guy. Somebody comes in, taps him on the shoulder, and takes the bass. It's Charles Mingus. And I recorded this on my little tape. I gave it to Phil Shapp. I never saw it again, but I'm just joking because Phil gave it back to me 30 years later.
Okay.
But anyway, so I was around these things. So at the Jazz Museum, in the back, they had a projection room where we would show films every Saturday or Sunday afternoon. And my job as a 14, 15-year-old was to actually, thread the, an old-fashioned thing, thread the movie into the camera and show it. And we would show The Sound of Jazz, and we would show Jam and the Blues. So I saw these things, I don't know, 100 times or more by the time I was 15 or 16. I had many, many experiences at the Jazz Museum. Jack Bradley, at that time, was really, and I met Dan Morgenstern at that time because Dan was on the board of the Jazz Museum. And we joke about it now because we've been friends for, almost 50 years, which is that I'm 60 now, so that would have been 47 years ago, but that he remembered me as a kid just pestering him all the time, And so I met him there. And then we had an exhibit on Benny Goodman. And I was a Benny Goodman fanatic already based on having that record at the public library, and I had started corresponding with D. Russ Connor. We called him Russ Connor. Russ Connor was the guy who wrote BG on the Record, which was the first, was the first bio-discography. Again, sounds like something you go to the doctor for.
Yeah, we'll have to treat you for that.
But that was a combination of a biography and a discography.
Yeah.
And he had a book out called BG on the Record, Benny Goodman on the Record. And I found it in a local library, and I started writing him postcards about, where can I find the alternate take of House Hop or something like this? Because, in those days it was hard to find. I mean, there's no internet, there's no nothing, and record stores and all this kind of stuff. And so I was very much enmeshed in collecting and getting to meet the musicians who would work with Goodman. Well, when we were preparing for the Goodman exhibit, Jaime Schertzer came in, and Jaime had been the lead alto player in Benny Goodman's band back in the 30s. And he really couldn't believe that, some kid knew who he was. And someone else came into the Jazz Museum, and I can't remember his name, but he was on WBAI radio here in New York, a Pacifica station. And they did really kind of esoteric programming and very leftish at that time. And somehow he said, would you like, I was kind of weird to find this 14, 15-year-old kid who wants to hear this old music. I came on his radio show just to talk about the Jazz Museum. And he offered me a few shows of my own. So I interviewed Jaime Schertzer, and then I interviewed Ray Nance when I was about 15 or so. And I said some of the stupidest things. I have a cassette of it somewhere, just horrible. You'll never hear them. But the bottom line was, so already this interest in history. Mm-hmm. So I met Benny Goodman at that exhibit thing when I was 15. And around the same time, when we were going to hear Teddy Wilson play with my parents, Teddy was playing at a place called The Cookery, which was 9th Street and University Place, which was owned by Barney Josephson, who used to own Cafe Society. And in the early 70s, he had Alberta Hunter made her come back at this club. Yeah. And Teddy Wilson played there and all kinds of people. Well, my parents took me down to see Teddy Wilson one night. This is all happening in these years. and Teddy had a tuxedo on. And the date, I'm not one of those date people, but I happen to remember it because I can picture it. It's either 1972 or 73. I think it was 72. And Teddy's dressed in a tuxedo, which he never wore. So, oh, Mr. Wilson, why are you wearing a tuxedo? He said, well, the National Urban League is giving an award to Lionel Hampton tonight at the Waldorf, and I'm going from here to there, and we're reuniting the original Benny Goodman Quartet will be playing. And I couldn't believe it. You know, I said, oh my God, you know, well, would you like to come with me? Would I like to come with you? You know, but then how am I, you know, what am I going to do? Well, my father's going to have to drive back, you know, leave me and there, you know, for 3 or 4 hours, and then either go back home to Fairlawn or go sit somewhere. And I went with Teddy Wilson, and I got autographs. It was Lionel Hampton, Gene Krupa, Benny Goodman, Lionel Hampton, Illinois Jacquette played with them, and I think it was George DeVivier or Slam Stewart. And I got all these autographs, and that was the first time that I met Goodman. And then when he came to the Jazz Museum, I said, well, I got your autograph, as though he would remember, you know. Oh. And he said, well, maybe you want to come, and I wanted a picture, an autographed picture. He said, well, call my office. So I called his office, and on a weekend or something, I went in, and there was a woman named Muriel Zuckerman, who had been Benny Goodman's personal aide for 40 years, like a real Girl Friday kind of thing. Mm-hmm. She was in love with the boss, and a wonderful woman. And I went in, and I got this autograph of Benny Goodman. Little did I know that I would be running that office several years later. So this is all just giving context to like what happened to me before I got to college. Then also in New Jersey, there was a jazz workshop at a place called Ramapo College, and it was one of the first, I think, serious like jazz, like summer jazz workshop kind of thing for kids. This is in the early 70s, mid 70s. And it was run by a man named Harold Lieberman, wonderful trumpet player. He did some studio work, and he had an assistant working for him by the name of Dick Lowenthal. And so they had this wonderful program, and among the faculty were Frankie Dunlop, the drummer who played with Thelonious Monk, Bucky Pizzarelli, Derek Smith, and oh man, there's someone else who I'm blanking on, Paul Jeffries, a saxophone player. And Kenny Washington, I met him there. He was on this thing. And so I was very lucky. When I talk about luck, you know, just at that time, kind of like a burgeoning of jazz education for kids. Mm-hmm. The Jazz Museum happened to start in New York. Teddy Wilson happened to have a weekend off and playing in Hackensack, New Jersey. And all these things are just coming together. Well, I fell in love with the Benny Goodman record at Carnegie Hall. And for whatever reason, I zeroed in on this tenor sax solo that Lester Young played on that concert. And I had taken a couple of clarinet lessons, never got very far on it, but at least I learned the fingering. And there was a tenor sax in the high school band room, and I kind of taught myself to play it. I mean, it's not hard to teach yourself the saxophone if you've taken a couple of clarinet lessons. I mean, it's very simple fingering and much simpler than the clarinet.
Yes, more friendly.
And so I picked it up and slowly began this move towards not focusing exclusively on the piano, but starting to play the saxophone. So that all happened at that time.
At 15 years of age.
About 15 or so.
Yeah.
And one last thing that was probably a real key component of all these things in terms of getting into school and becoming more professional was that at the Jazz Museum, one of Jack Bradley's closest friends was the cornetist Ruby Braff. And Ruby was a real character, and I eventually became his personal manager, and that's another story. But Ruby heard me play the piano at the museum as much as I could play, and he kind of said, you know, it's pretty bad. He says, but you know, you've got some potential there. You really should study with this guy named Sanford Gold, who was kind of a legendary, well, I didn't know, kind of a legendary piano teacher in New York in the 60s, 70s, maybe 50s, 60s, 70s, and all kinds of people studied with him from A to Z, classical, jazz. He taught technique, but he also married the study of the piano into theory. So as you learned, I mean, he didn't teach beginning players, but as you learned to play this Chopin etude, or as you learned to play Waltz for Debbie, or whatever it was, you were mapping out the harmonic sphere. And he had his own system of diminished chords and substitution chords and all this kind of stuff. It was pretty good. And so I studied with, so what happened was he charged $25 a lesson. This is 1973 or so. And that was unheard of. I mean, I was taking piano lessons in Ridgewood, New Jersey for, I don't know, for $5 or $10. And my parents were really skeptical. One day when my dad came to pick me up at the Jazz Museum, Ruby came out with Jack Bradley, and they talked to my father. My dad didn't know who Ruby Bradley was, except that Jack probably said he's a great musician. Mm-hmm. He said, Mr. Schoenberg, your son has some talent, but he's really not too good, but if he has any potential, he should go with Sanford Gold. It's 25 miles. I said, well, I'm sorry, but we're not going to do that. And Ruby and Jack said, well, we'll pay for it then. Now, whether they really would have or not, I don't know. It doesn't make a difference. But the gesture of having said that convinced my parents that I should study with Sanford Gold. And that is probably the most significant thing that happened to me in between playing the piano at 4 years old and getting into Manhattan School of Music as a piano minor, third year piano minor, when I was 17 or 18. Because he was meticulous. Sanford Gold could hear wrong fingering. Whoa. He could hear wrong finger. I mean, and it's not just me saying it. He was famous for it. He'd be in another part of the room, facing another way while you were playing. And he'd say, second finger. I mean, he could tell from the articulation of the note. Now, also studying with him at that time were John Faddis and Lou Soloff, who were both new in New York and roommates, I guess, or very close friends. And they were studying with him. They couldn't have, John's not that much older than me. He was probably 19 or something. And I remember they were crazy, and I remember meeting other people in those days at his studio. So if you put all that together, it starts to give you a picture of where I was when I went to college. You
went to college before you went to college.
Yes.
That's the way I feel about it.
Yeah.
Because you can't pay for that stuff that you got.
Absolutely.
And
yeah. A question you asked a while ago was like, did I realize or did I know? Like we mentioned, you were in a car with Milt Hinton over here. I slip on your shoulder. You're saying that, wait a minute, this is not just some old bass player. This is Milton J. Hinton, and this is Fiddler Claude Williams or these people. The only way that I can answer your question is, you were older when that happened to you. I assume you were in your 30s or something. For me in my teens, frankly, I thought that's the way that life was. And I knew, I treated them with great respect. Of course, I think now about how I behaved, and I go, oh my God, but no, I had no idea of how great it was.
Yeah. In some ways, it's great. when I was in my teens, I had a couple experiences, but they were a different level, like Chuck and Gapman Joan in Rochester.
Oh.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that was my thing. And at the time, it was the same. I was respectful. I was a little envious. They're doing what I would like to do. But then later on, when you know the history of these people, and so that's a heck of a story. Jazz has been called America's only original art form.
When you transcribe this, you can transcribe that I'm going to roll my eyes.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I'm rolling mine too.
Good.
But I'm off camera.
He's
so
off camera. Okay.
But what about the blues?
What about the blues?
What about the blues? Isn't the blues its own original American art form?
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah.
Okay. Why did you roll your eyes at the?
Because there's two things that I roll my eyes at, and I roll them in great respect. And he did roll his eyes. Okay.
Yes.
Those kind of statements, I don't know how much good they do. I don't know how much light they shed on anything, because what about cartoons? What about a certain kind of cinema? What about any number of things that are uniquely American? Early on, Albert Murray had me read a book called American Humor by Constance Rourke. It was written back around 1930 or so. And you start to see all these various components of so many different things that are part Native American and part African American and part Yankee and part Dutch and part Asian and all these kind of things. And you start to realize early on that, the one and only kind of thing doesn't really work. And the other statement, we can just get it out of the way, that I also really roll my eyes at is jazz is America's classical music. And also, jazz was America's popular music at one time, which it never was. So those are the three oft-repeated canards, moldy canards that, kind of get me going, But, yeah.
Now I can use it. Hey, next time you see Loren, want him watch his roll his eyes? Just try this one on him.
And you can take that little video clip of me and just loop it.
Yeah.
Right. But
Yeah.
anyway,
Yeah, the first time I saw Jazz is America's classical music was in the context of another person saying, please, let's not call it that. Do you want it to be treated like classical music is treated? Do you want it to be shown only, the whole routine?
Yeah, and let's not forget, that Ellington and Dizzy Gillespie and Max Roach and Fletcher and many other people wanted to get rid of the word jazz early on. But that's not so much about my biography, but these are important things to talk about.
What would they
Frankly, Monk, if this was another context, I would love to interview. Right now, I'm kind of dying to know what you think about all these things. No, but I mean it. I'm serious, because you've taught and you've been around for a long time and have the benefit of this incredible archive of interviews that I haven't said I'm proud to be asked to be a member of. And I'm not being unctuous here, I spend quite a bit of time watching them. I won't look at them for a while, then I'll go back and oh my God, look at this, and I'll look at one that I didn't want to look at another time. And I've learned a lot from them. So I would love to hear your take on all this stuff too.
Well, don't you think that usually explaining things and putting them in context, historical and otherwise, is usually left to the people who are not doing it. The people that are doing it think less about where is my work fitting in to the timeline and the whole development thing. They're doing it because they're driven. Mm-hmm. And then years later it will get sorted out.
Yeah,
but not by them, but by somebody else.
Well, some of them were very conscious of it. Some of them did see it all.
Like who would you say?
John Lewis, Benny Carter, Duke Ellington, for starters, Dizzy Gillespie, Max Roach, Wynton Marsalis.
Okay.
But I think that part of that is, and just let me think for 1 second. The thought went out of my head.
Okay.
It's okay. Yeah. If you want me to pick up the story of my life kind of thing, or you want to?
Well, I have a question
okay,
about
sure.
Maybe here's a scenario. You're at a cocktail party, and in the conversation it comes up that you're in jazz, and someone says, "Well, jazz, I just don't get it. When they start doing that, whatever they do, I guess it's they're making it up. I don't get it." Do you have anything that you can offer that person to help them?
Yeah, sure. 95 out of 100 people that I meet, if it comes up that I'm a jazz musician or a jazz person or somehow involved with jazz, and it's not hyperbole, it's literal, way over 95% over the last 40 years. Oh, I'm a jazz saxophone player. Really? I don't know a lot about jazz. I like some of it or I don't like it, but they always say, I really don't know anything. And this has really been a huge benefit to me in terms of trying to comprehend how to teach it and also how to try and build an institution like the Jazz Museum. So my first response is, let me ask you a question. When you go to a restaurant and order salmon, do you say to the waiter, "I'll have the salmon, please"? I don't know much about salmon. I really don't know much about it, but I'd like to order it. You don't feel compelled to express your ignorance. But something about the way that jazz has evolved leads the great majority of people to express ignorance. And that's a huge red flag, and that's something that it's incumbent upon all of us to deal with, to try and destigmatize it. It's been stigmatized, and that's a fact.
Stigmatized how?
That there's something to know that I don't know. There's nothing to know about jazz. There's nothing to know about eating a piece of salmon. There's nothing to know about, walking down the street. There's nothing to know about it. You like it or you don't like it. And if you can let go of the preconceptions, If you like it and if you're curious, maybe you'll want to know more about it. But there's nothing to know. I mean, Jesus, there's nothing to know about. I mean, think of some of the most basic functions that we do for enjoyment in life. I mean, you know, when you first got into it, was it because you wanted to learn something? I don't think so. And in terms of enjoying art, I really think it's exactly the same way. Then you want to study it. Oh, this happened. I didn't like, or I did like. Well, talk to somebody else about it. I heard this kind of jazz. Boy, I like that, but I didn't like this. So that's been hugely stigmatized.
I love that, because I've had people say, I don't like jazz. I don't understand it. I like Beethoven. And I feel like saying, do you understand Beethoven? What do you understand about Beethoven that
There
makes
you go.
like it? And I wouldn't be that sarcastic, but I like what you say. That
Well, my thing isn't sarcastic.
no,
Right.
Yeah.
It's very sincere. Do you think about when you talk about a food you like, do you say that I don't know anything about it, but I'd like to order it? And when you listen to music, I mean, what happened in jazz that got to the point where over 9 out of 10 people have to say, I don't know much about it? It's insane.
Is it because now it's high art?
I think it's, I don't know that's possible. I think part of it is that, okay, getting back to what we talked about quite a while ago. So the overwhelming headline in talking about anything about jazz and all this part of this conversation that we're having, which is not biographical so much as about the state of jazz, you know, there's this looping headline all the time, which is race. Okay? So let's keep that in mind as it's floating behind our heads while we're talking. Okay. So what is it about jazz? How did this evolve? Well, let's look at it this way. There was a great lie in the 19th century, and the lie is you got to watch out for the black slave, because he's going to escape and rape all the white women. Of course, these prejudices are very much present in a lot of popular music today, and in a lot of the racial hang-ups of our country in many, many ways. Now, where does that come from? It comes from the fact that the truth is, in the 19th century, that the great amount of sexual shenanigans and crimes were committed by white slave owners against slaves, or enslaved people, depending on which term you prefer to use, okay? To cover up from the shame of that lie, through minstrelsy and many, many other forms of popular entertainment, Americans, to assuage that feeling of horrible guilt, created the African-American male as a asexual, cartoonish, buffoonish kind of figure. All one has to do is watch Spike Lee's film Bamboozled, which we watch in my jazz history class sometimes, along with Rashomon, but that's another story. Okay, so to compensate for that feeling of guilt and that feeling of responsibility, a certain type of minstrelsy evolves. Now, eventually, white appropriation notwithstanding, jazz evolves to a point where the French are taking it seriously, and other European countries are taking it intellectually and seriously, and America at some point, and I'm glossing over so much here, it culturally eventually says, you know, we should be proud of jazz. People all around the world say it's so serious. We should be. And guess what we're going to do? We're going to take it out of its natural milieu, which would be like what John Batiste calls his band social music, and what I think Louis Armstrong will use terms like that, maybe even Ellington, social music that was somehow integrated with social functions, and not something abstract that one listens to like this, but, or, you know. And so eventually, what did we do? We killed it by putting it in the concert hall. Now, let me back up for a moment. I don't mean we killed it by putting it in the concert hall. That's a gloss. What I mean to say is that by taking it away from dancing, and by taking it away from good times and what Albert Murray writes about in Stompin' the Blues and many, many other places, there was a price to be paid. And the price that was paid, that it found its place in the concert hall. Now, you might ask yourself the question of, why do people, especially in America, but why do we behave the way that we behave in the concert hall listening to classical music? I mean, it's the strangest thing in the world, right? And I won't go into I have a long rap about this I do when I'm teaching, and I'm sure you do too. But you know, the behavior in the concert hall, the opening of the rapper, the people who are asleep, the people who have no idea what the hell they're listening to, except they feel like they're eating their spinach, and they're going to see a concert, and they don't really, the great majority of them, I don't think, are that engaged in it. Okay, now we put jazz in there, okay, and take it away from its roots. I think the Ellington Band probably had the healthiest diet of Carnegie Hall, colleges, great recordings, dances, parties, great event. And so the music was informed by all these levels. That's the beginning of kind of trying to come to terms with what we're talking about. I'm sorry if I'm a little scattershot here because I'm merging, like you, Monk, I've been teaching a long time and I have like, you know, these things
Lots of
I
resources
do,
to pull.
but they're not really coalescing here. But somehow, so when I say there's nothing to understand about jazz, so then you have some responsibility also on part of the musicians. Now, the musician might say, jazz musician might say, when Vladimir Horowitz comes out to play, or the Juilliard String Quartet, they don't go to the microphone and say, I hope you like this little tune by Schubert. You know, when he wrote it, I have a funny story about it and all that kind of stuff. They just play. But by mimicking the behavior of not necessarily explaining what they're doing to the audience, or acting in a way that kind of projects an exclusivity or non-inclusion, or being too hip for the room, then then you start to get kind of masochistic people who actually enjoy being treated either rudely or curtly by a band. And it's all complicated. And I actually don't have the answer, but I can just throw out these various observations, and maybe someone, if I thought about it, I could kind of make it cohesive.
When we do part 2 of this interview, we'll reflect on that.
Okay.
A lot of food for thought there.
Yeah.
Okay. Let me get back to your bio a bit. Was it the Benny Goodman Association? Did it take some getting used to with Benny?
Well, what happened was I went to Manhattan School of Music in 1976. Music theory major, piano minor. And eventually switched to saxophone major, which means that I got to study with Joe Allard, who was a great teacher, a guy named Dave Tafani. But at the same time, Manhattan School of Music is in the old Juilliard building. It's up at 122nd Street and Claremont Avenue, Manhattan. And just down the street from where I was living was a club called the West End that was run by Phil Shapp. And this is a major moment. I mean, I hope somebody, writes a monograph or a thesis on what Phil Shapp did at the West End Cafe in the 1970s. Because what he did was, people like, I won't name names, but there were great musicians from the Fletcher Henderson, Count Basie, Jay McShann bands who were working as bank guards or working as literally messengers on Wall Street. Just, walking around like the bag I had around their neck and delivering stock things. I mean, they were not making a living in music and they were struggling. So what Phil did was Phil put together 7 nights a week of jazz at the West End. Joe Jones one night, Harold Ashby the next night, Sammy Price the next night, Eddie Durham, Francis Williams, Ram Ramirez, guys who played with Louis Armstrong you've probably never heard of, George James, drummers like Percy Bryce and Sonny Greer. I got to work with Sonny Greer there. And what Phil did, I mean, not only was it musically fascinating because, my God, there's like these giants of a past era. They're playing right there every night. You can hang out and listen. But also he gave them a social life. In other words, for a musician who had played with Count Basie or Duke Ellington or Erskine Hawkins or one of those great bands, to know that Thursday night, I'm putting on my suit, I'm getting my horn out, I'm going to play, and this crazy guy, this crazy Phil Shapp guy who knows everything that ever was about jazz, he's going to be there and he's going to know that I played the solo on this alternate take of King Porter Stomp. That meant so much to these people. It was a profound thing. And so I lived around the corner. The first 2 years, Manhattan School of Music had no dormitories. So we lived in apartments, mostly owned by old ladies, who were known to the school, that they could tell your parents, oh, well, he's going to be rooming with Mrs. Ash, and she's had students for 30 years, and she's very safe and all this kind of stuff. So I lived in an apartment at 112th and Riverside Drive that was just around the corner from the West End. And, you know, I was so not desperate, well, I was desperate. I was desperate to sit in and to play. And they see a young guy come in with a saxophone. Oh, my God, he's going to be another one of these guys who doesn't know the songs. And so one night, there was a group led by Francis Williams. Now, Francis Williams is someone whose name you'll never read about. He was kind of like in the same league as like a Joe Wilder. In other words, classically trained, read fly specs, and even more than Joe. He was different than Joe. He was not the soloist, the great personal soloist that Joe was. He played great, fine solos, but he was like a Snooky Young or Al Killian, or he was like a dynamite lead player. And he had a band with Eddie Durham. And I was so desperate to sit in with them, I just took out my saxophone one night and during a break, just to show them like that I wasn't going to muck it up. And I played a little, I said, okay, you can sit in. And this began a long association with Eddie Durham that was profound for me on many, many levels, musically, but also 50% culturally. And so what happened was, while I was at Manhattan School of Music, switching to saxophone major, some great musicians were around there. Ted Rosenthal was in school, a guy named Roy Gerson, Manny Mendelsohn, other names will come back to me. Some really, really fine players were in school at that time. You mentioned, you know, about studying before going to college before college. Well, this was even more. So Eddie Durham had a quartet, and I wound up playing in his quartet in a small town up in the Catskills called Goshen, New York, exit 124 off of Route 6 and Route 17. And I wound up playing there for years, maybe 3 or 4 years with him on the weekends. So his band was all people like him, older musicians, a drummer named Harold Austin, who had been the drummer with Jonah Jones's quartet and had been in Harlem since the 30s. A wonderful piano player named Kelly Owens, who was on Big Maybell and those early R&B-ish kind of records. And there I was, this little kid, 18, 19, wow, but playing night after night, after long set, just exposed to these sounds. I mean, you know, Eddie Durham was the guy who created, you know, the modern Benny Moten band and the Count Basie band. And, I mean, in terms of the arrangements, and he was also a pioneer on the electric guitar, and he played the electric guitar in that band too. And so, just to wrap this one thing up, but the other part of it, besides the music, was, and this gets back to another early question of yours, about sociological versus musicological.
Okay.
Here I am, an 18-year-old Jewish kid from the suburbs, and I'm being welcomed into this world of these African-American musicians who are 60 and 70, and who they're staying with, and how people treat one another. And all I can say is like, I was so, I mean, I could get very emotional now, and I'm not going to, but, you know, they were so warm and loving and accepting and encouraging in every way that I experienced something about a world that, like, I didn't know about. It wasn't like my world, not to put my world down. And I used to think all the time about the inverse, well-meaning white liberal people who might take in someone as I was to them into their midst and wrap their arms around them. I don't think it would have been the same. I don't think it would have been the same. And as I got older and started to reflect after decades and years about all those things and what those people went through and what their lives were like and the great joys and satisfactions. And when I say they, that's a dangerous thing to do, to generalize. All I can talk about is the people that I was with. And I experienced things and the music, and that's, I mean, I didn't realize it then. I'm just starting to realize it now. But the music was all part of that. the music is not just something, I've just come to realize this recently at 60, but the music is not just something that happens on the bandstand with C7 and A7 and an old Lester Young solo. The music is something that comes out of the life and out of the experience and out of all these things. Boy, do I wish I had learned that lesson a lot earlier in life. But now I can look back and see all that and how I was the beneficiary of that. And that kind of, for no pun intended, colored my way of understanding things. So that was a tremendously significant thing while I was in college.
Well, that explains, I think, partly one of your answers early on today with the sociology and the musicology. And I can also see why you spend so much preparation time with your jazz history class, not to just start out with a person, okay, here we go, Louis Armstrong, and we're going to move forward. And
right.
Well,
and understanding who Nick Payton is. You know what I mean? Or who Wynton Marsalis is.
Yeah.
Or whom you are, or I am, or any of these people are. And you start to put it in that context. So that happened in those years. And then, in the meantime, I had mentioned Russ Connor before, and BG on the record, and the Benny Goodman biodiscographer. So I had been very much pursuing that stuff too, collecting records, and I was doing radio shows, in college and all this kind of stuff, like a lot of us did. And because I knew Hank Jones as an idol and as somebody who my parents loved and who would get me into gigs to see, I was actually around backstage at some Benny Goodman concerts with Ruby Green and Benny and Bucky Pizzarelli and Hank and all those people. Just as a kid, just sitting there, just quiet. I don't know how quiet I was, but just sitting there kind of looking, and never in a million years thinking that I could play with them, but that I was just lucky to be there. And so there was a little more of a connection around the Benny Goodman circle of things. Scott Hamilton had come to New York at that time and was just unbelievable. I mean, that's another fascinating thing what Scott did and his band of musicians. And then, in my fourth year of college, I got a phone call from Benny Goodman. And I felt like saying, this is Benny Goodman. And I was going to say, I'm Marty Shaw, and hang up the phone. And it turns out that he was donating his music library to the New York Public Library. And he had contacted Russ Connor, the guy who wrote the book about him. And he said, Russ, I need someone to write the accompanying, I think they call it a provenance or something, the accompanying monograph or little book about these arrangements. In other words, when were they written and what key were they in and were they recorded? And Russ, he worked at the Federal Reserve Bank in Philadelphia, he didn't have time. He said, well, there's this crazy kid in New York, who is always collecting your records. Maybe he might know, and he's a musician. So I left school. I don't have a bachelor's degree. I'm one of the rare people who wound up teaching in the master's, who I taught in the graduate school of the school I never graduated from, which I guess you can't do anymore, right?
No, you can't.
You had to have a doctorate, to do anything. But anyway, I left school and went to work for Benny Goodman, and he was paying me, I think it was $250 a week, to come in, and my job was to say, to have a stack of arrangements and say, now there's three versions of the King Porter Stomp here. Now two are in D flat, there's one in G, and this one has Fletcher Henderson's name on it, but this one doesn't, but it says Ziggy on the trumpet part or something like that. And so, it was just a dream come true. That lasted, I forget how long, a few months, and I wrote this little thing, the music went to the New York Public Library, and that was it. So, in New York at that time, this is 1980, and already, I could make a living. Playing in just a million different bands. You know what it was like. Stan Rubin's band one night, and then filling in at Eddie Condon's maybe one night, and then a wedding that paid more money than all of it put together, a bar mitzvah, then playing solo piano in a restaurant, and then playing with a million different bands, for cheap money. But it all added up, and I was 21, 22 years old. What the hell, So that was the end of that. Now, I had done my first concert, again with my family. My parents put up the money for it, although it did turn a profit. And June 1979, I guess I was just about to turn 21. I produced a concert at Carnegie Recital Hall, and it was called A Tribute to Bird and Prez. And we played the super sax arrangements, and then I orchestrated these Lester Young solos for a sax section of myself. And the featured soloists were Howard McGee, who I had already been working with a little bit, Warren Vacher, Eddie Burt, Dickie Wells, Joe Albany. I was already in his quartet. Joe Albany on piano. He had just come back to New York and was healthy for a short time. Herb Ellis, a bass player I was working with named Peck Morrison, who was in the Duke Ellington Band, and Mel Lewis, who I had started a friendship with on drums. So that was June 1979. We got a review in the New York Times, which was not a bad review by John S. Wilson. So I was kind of building up, starting to have a chance to do some of this stuff.
Yeah.
Then when I stopped working for Benny, I just went back to playing and whatever. But when I was going through his big band music in the course of working on this thing, I asked him if I could copy a few arrangements. I didn't really know why I was going to copy them. Well, I think I might have had an inkling. And so he let me copy some music on the Xerox machine, just, 5 or 6 arrangements. I had been playing in a lot of big bands around New York. The only way to play, if you loved swing music and loved big band music, the only way to play it in 1979 or 80 for a young musician was in these kind of like second-rate bands that played stock arrangements or transcriptions, and you might have 3 or 4 really great players in the band and some others that weren't so great. It was a lot of fun and it paid, but it was not at all excellent playing. So one of those bands was a band led by a guy named Bob January, and the singer in his band was Barbara Lee. And we became friends. And I was such a pain in the neck, I guess, at these rehearsals that Bob said, why don't you lead the band? That kind, screw you, that kind of thing. And I stood up, and I'm going to lead the band and whatever. And I found out that we were playing, I'll never forget, we were playing a stock arrangement of 920 Special. And it turns out that there were 4 trumpets. The 4th trumpet player had a different stock arrangement. And they had been playing it for 20 years. And it was almost the same, but a little bit different. And so I guess whoever played the 4th trumpet part would just modify it by listening. And I said, can I see that part for a moment? I said, this is the wrong arrangement. Well, to jump, I decided to put together a big band.
Yeah.
And I brought with me, Robbie Scott was the drummer, and Barbara Lee was singing. And I must say, I put together a band. I started a rehearsal band. And I had some more music I had copied from Benny Goodman, and then other people I started to get some charts from different people, copies of this. People like a guy named Bill Schremp and Dean Pratt and some other people, were also big band people, and they had music. And we started to rehearse, and it started to sound pretty good. And as I mentioned, I forget how, but I had met Mel Lewis. And I remember asking a friend, saying, man, I wonder if I could ask Mel to come down and rehearse. What are we going to ask Mel? For Christ's sake, he has his own band at the Vanguard. He said, well, the worst he can do is say no. So he came down, he made a rehearsal. I called some really good charts. And everybody in the bands, John Carisi was playing trumpet, Dick Sudhalter, a wonderful trombone player named F. Resnick, Ephraim, E-P-H, you can look him up in the discographies. Bobby Pring, Bob Kindred, Akira Omori, and I'm trying to think who else you might know. Some really, really great players. Frank Tate played bass, and the drummer was Fred Stoll. Really great players. Well, Mel came down and sat in, liked it, and said, I'll come back next week. Well, when Mel said he would come back next week, and no one's getting paid. I'm paying for the rehearsal space and taping all the music and copying all the charts, but I loved it. I had nothing else to do. When Mel started making it, then all of a sudden, Danny Bank wants to play. Or Eddie Burt, or Paulie Cohen, or whomever. So I started to assemble a band. There was a mixture of Doug Lawrence and Ken Poplawski and Chuck Wilson and Matt Finders and Tony Cadleck later and young players, and it was about 50% young and 50% older. Of course, much young. The old guys were younger than I am now, and so the band started to cotton. And in the meantime, Goodman asked me to come back because this woman I had mentioned before, Muriel Zuckerman, who had been his Girl Friday, she quit. And he said, can you come in and just, until I find someone, answer the phones or just help with something? So I started doing that. And that eventually, when he found out that I knew musicians and I had a band, well, can you recommend somebody? And you know, so then he started to trust me. And then started saying, well, you can go ahead and book the band. Or can you write these checks? Or can you answer this letter to so-and-so? And what the hell? I mean, it doesn't take a lot of brains to write a letter, you know. So I started, and I wound up becoming his personal manager, I guess is what you would call it. Some people, you know, you might be question that. What does that mean, a personal manager? Benny Goodman didn't have an agent. He didn't need an agent. What happened in Benny Goodman's office was he got 1,000 offers a year to play. I mean, people just calling him. He had no agent. It was just called the office of Benny Goodman. Hello, yes, I'm so-and-so from the Pori Jazz Festival in Finland. We'd like Mr. Goodman to play on August 9th, and we can offer X amount of dollars. So I would assemble all the offers, and he would pick which ones he wanted to do. We hired the band, and he had a travel agent.
Yeah.
So this all started. Well, in the meantime, this band that I put together, we started getting some gigs. And for $5 each, or I would pay for it or something like that with the money I was making playing. And we started playing at a place called the Red Blazer 2, which was on 3rd Avenue and 88th Street. And boy, the band was really good, and I was getting more charts. Johnny Carisi gave me some charts, and then I got to know Benny Carter through Ed Berger, and I got a handful of copies of some Benny Carter charts, and just a whole bunch of other stuff. And early Ellington things at that time. And we made a record. Well, and I want to mention one other name, and it sounds like a storybook, but it's really true. John Hammond, who was Benny Goodman's brother-in-law,
Yes.
and they were not talking, and I can tell you about that if you're curious as to why that was. He was, he was a guy who was, he discovered Bruce Springsteen and George Benson and Aretha Franklin and all these people. He brought them to fame. But at this time in the early 80s, he still loved big bands, he loved jazz, and I guess in the 30s or 40s, if John Hammond came to your gig, that was, you were going to be the next Count Basie or something like that. By 1980, in the early 80s,
Who's John Hammond?
Who's this old guy?
Yeah.
Well, he still loved big bands. And I met him, through Goodman's office, because he wasn't talking to Benny at that time, and there were some things I had to work around. And I invited him to come hear the band. And he brought Buck Clayton with him. So then Buck started to give me music. And I want to be clear when I say give me music. Later on, as the band got professional, and as I started to make a living in music, all those guys, I paid for arrangements, and I paid arrangers, and I paid, but this time there was nothing there. So John Hammond and a few other things, and things started, and next thing you know, we're going to make a record. So we made a record for a guy named Jerry Valburn, who issued a lot of radio broadcasts, like a big jazz collector who had his own little labels.
Yeah.
And he had a label, he started recording stuff, so I was going to make a big band record for him, if I could pay for the band. And then he would put it out. So we did a record, it's called That's the Way It Goes, in 1984. And the band on that record was Dick Katz, Howard Alden, Phil Flanagan, Mel Lewis, Bobby Pring, Eddie Burt, and Matt Finders. Or maybe Bobby Pring missed it. He was on tour with the Widespread Depression Band. Mm-hmm. And my sax section was already set. We were set for about Chuck Wilson and Jack Stuckey on altos, Ken Poplowski and Doug Lawrence on tenors, and Danny Bank. And the trumpets were, on that first record, Paulie Cohen, Laurie Frink, Dick Sethalter, and John Eckert. And so that was the band. We made this record. It was pretty damn good. We did it at the old RCA studios. It was the old RCA studios on tape with a legendary engineer named Bob Simpson. And it was really, really great. So we made the record, and I gave a copy to Goodman, who I was working for still at that time. And I said, here's my record, because we recorded a few of his things. I said, oh, he never said a word about it, man. He never said, it's good, it's bad. And I'm 25 years old, whatever. I'm dying for him to say something, tell me something. And then the way it worked was Goodman's office, his office and his apartment were in a building called the Manhattan House, which is on East 66th Street between 2nd and 3rd Avenues. He had the penthouse on 3rd Avenue, and on the 2nd Avenue side of the building was a little one-bedroom apartment that was his office. So I would go to work in the office, he'd be up in his penthouse on the other avenue over here, and he would call and say, bring the checks up, or I'm meeting someone for lunch, or can you come up and have lunch? There's nobody, And so we kind of went back and forth. He started calling me from his apartment with my record playing in the background. but didn't say anything. You know, I don't. That's what you call passive aggressive. Or I don't know what the word is, but it was messing with me. And I'd hear my record in the background. And of course, I'm dying to say, well, you know, what do you think? But I wouldn't give in. You know. Well, finally, one day, I mean, this anecdote sounds improbable, and it is improbable. He lived in Stamford, Connecticut, on Rock Rimmon Road, and his girlfriend at that time, his wife had died. His girlfriend was a woman named Carol Phillips, who ran Clinique, which was a woman's makeup, like, you know, stuff, you know.
Okay.
And, you know, makeup and perfume and hand cream and eyelash stuff and all that kind of stuff. A boutique thing. And they were going out together. And he had a Mercedes. So on some weekends, I would actually drive Benny up with Carol to their house, like the chauffeur, drive them up to Stamford, leave them. Then I would drive his car back and park it in his garage. And I mean, I'd never driven a Mercedes-Benz, but that's another story. Drive it back, park in his garage, and somehow they would get back on Sunday. Well, one time I went up there, and one time I went up there, they invited me for lunch. And one time he said, let's go swimming. Yeah, swimming pool. Okay, you know, so we went swimming. And while we were swimming, he told me that he was going to hire my band. Because what happened was Dick Hyman had been approached by public television, because it was the 50th anniversary of Benny's breakthrough, 1985. And they wanted to do a public television show about it. So Dick Hyman was going to put together a band of Jimmy Maxwell and all the guys, Toots Mandela or whoever was still alive, and all the great musicians. And frankly, Benny didn't want to see them anymore. And I don't think they really wanted to see him. It was not a warm relationship between those people, unfortunately, for the most part. Some loved him, but most didn't. And so he told Dick Hyman and PBS, I'm not going to do it with a reunion band. Then he heard my band, and he wound up hiring my band, and we became the last Benny Goodman Orchestra. So he started rehearsing it and changed it, and that's a whole nother story. I don't know how much you want to get into it, but that was a whole thing, seeing him rehearse Fletcher Henderson and all those arrangements.
Wow.
Got rid of Mel Lewis, didn't want Mel Lewis, so we had Louis Bellson. He wanted Bob Haggart on bass. So he put Bob Haggart and Louis Bellson in the band, and Dick Hyman took the place of Dick Katz. But outside of that, it was my band. I mean, it was the same band that I had had. And it was a real, boy, it was a lesson for me, seeing what a great band leader can do to what was a very good band, and then turn it into the sparkling, shining Benny Goodman Orchestra. And that was something. And then I joined the great legion of people who were let go of a Benny Goodman band. My own band.
Your own band.
I was gone. My place was taken by Ted Nash. And I'll say now, in 34 years retrospect, Ted's a better section player than I am, you know. But that was a life lesson, you know what I mean. And then Benny died the following June, and I mean, I kept doing gigs with the band anyway when I had gigs. And Benny passed away, and then I decided soon after there that this was not going to be a Benny Goodman ghost band. I mean, his estate eventually said there will be no ghost band. But I really had no desire to go down the road like some other band leaders did. I mean, I played Carnegie Hall with Bob Wilbur on the 50th anniversary of the Carnegie Hall concert. I had no desire to go down that. A, I don't play the clarinet. B, without Ken Poplowski or a handful of, young guys from my generation back 35 years ago, there were not that many who you'd want to hear play a Benny Goodman concert because it would suck. I mean, there were a handful, but not that many. And I didn't know them, you know. So gave that up and then started recording our own albums. And we did 4 or 5 albums for Music Masters. And they were nice combinations of, I'm no great arranger. I can arrange. Most of the arranging I ever did was for Bobby Short during the years when I had his band. But with my own big band, no. I mean, I wanted much better writers than me. So eventually James Chirillo and Mark Lopeman and Mike Christensen arranged. Plus, Mel and others who were in the band said, when Benny took the band to Moscow in 1962, he commissioned Tad Dameron and Bob Brookmeyer and Johnny Carisi and a few other people to write all this great music, the majority of which never was recorded.
Oh.
So we started recording those things. And we made a series of records starting in 1980. Well, the first one was 84, then the second version of the band, 1987, for about 10 years, we made a record every couple of years. Eventually, Steve Wilson came in the band, and and other great players. So anyway,
Well, you are one of the luckiest guys in the world then.
yes, I am.
We've been at this for quite a while, so we're going to have to do part 2. But I wanted to ask you about the Jazz Museum in Harlem. Did you have to interview for that position?
Mm.
And did you give them a philosophy, a pitch, so to speak?
In the early 1990s, I started to branch out a little bit more. I was involved with something called the American Jazz Orchestra with John Lewis that started in 1985, 1986. And this was a band comprised of mostly big band veterans. Marvin Stamm, Virgil Jones, John Eckert, Benny Powell, Jimmy Knepper, Eddie Burt, I think I said him, Danny Bank and Jerry Dodgen, or Jerome Richardson and Bill Easley and Dick Katz and great bass players, including we made a record with Ron Carter and Howard Collins on guitar. It was a great band. And we started doing concerts down at Cooper Union. And this was a chance to work with John Lewis, who was an absolute idol of mine, as he would be for most anybody, because I loved his piano playing so much, on top of everything else. And that band lasted about maybe 8 years or so. Gary Giddens was the artistic director. And we made a series of recordings. Probably the best known one would be Central City Sketches with Benny Carter. And this is when Benny, at the age of 79 or 80, came out of retirement and wrote a suite and recorded it. And when it came out on an album, and it created quite a bit of buzz. It was a great record, Central City Sketches. And we also recorded the music of Duke Ellington for Nestle Erdogan on Atlantic Records, where I had to play all the Ben Webster things. And the music of Jimmy Lunsford, and maybe one more record. So that took up a lot of my time. And at that point, I started to become more of a conductor, also conducting guest bands or orchestras. So I would conduct when John wasn't there. Then Mel Lewis had been working for years with what they call the Westdeutsche Rundfunk, which is the radio orchestra in Cologne, Germany. And he got me on that. So for 2 summers, I conducted that orchestra in Cologne. Did the Rhapsody in Blue, and a funny story about that with Gunther Schuller. And the Rhapsody in Blue and the Paul Whiteman program with the full arrangements for the strings and all this kind of stuff. And did another concert with Milt Grayson, who had sung with Duke Ellington's band, and Lynn Roberts. And then another repertory band started called the Smithsonian Jazz Orchestra. Mm-hmm. And the conductors of that were Gunther Schuller and David Baker. And I was hired originally to be the contractor, to be the tenor soloist, and to be kind of like the third conductor. That didn't really happen. I wound up becoming the substitute conductor when Gunther or David couldn't make it. And that band lasted a lot. That band is still going, but my days in it were about maybe 10 years or so. And there I got to meet a whole nother tranche of big band veterans and people that weren't in New York who I didn't get to know. And there, were all these other wonderful musicians. So at that point, I started to lose the impetus after 10 or 15 years of having my own big band and of, copying all those parts. I mean, I used to, before Jazz Lincoln Center started all that stuff, I still have a dent in my finger. A guy named Mark Tucker, who was a wonderful Ellington scholar. He edited the Ellington Reader. He was the one who prepared the Ellington big band, the Ellington Musical Library that eventually went to the Smithsonian. It is now, John Hassey got it at the Smithsonian. And he gave me Xerox copies of file cabinets worth of handwritten Ellington scores. So I started transcribing those for my band, which was a great lesson. And I tried to get with this finger right here, with the old pencil and the old thing. And even with my students now, when I have them do kind of writing assignments, I kind of insist as much as I can that they do it by hand. I mean, all the computer, that's great, and that's what they're going to do. But you are going to write out this Ellington thing by hand, the third alto part, looking at the concert score and saying, okay, it's G sharp and all that kind of stuff. Because you learn so much more. So I started having, I stopped having like the impetus to have my own band and go. Plus I was teaching I started teaching at the New School I worked with Sylvia Sims, a great singer. And her trio was Fred Hirsch and Steve Laspina and myself. And Fred was teaching at the New School. This would have been around 1990. And he said, man, would you like to fill in and sub? I can't make them. I said, well, what's the class? Well, some kind of like styles and analysis, but you can do whatever the hell you want. So I went in, and I really enjoyed it. And so I called Fred back, and I said, would you mind if I called up Martin Mueller, the head of the program, and like pitched myself for a class? But I said, only if you say okay. He said, I don't care. I'm going to leave there anyway. But, please, if you want, you take my class. I really don't care. I don't have time for it right now. So I called up, and I started designing my own classes there, which would cover kind of like Ellington and Brahms. And I would take them through a Brahms symphony for a month or two, and then an Ellington extended work, and look for the intersections in terms of the narrative structure of composition and orchestration. I was teaching myself this stuff and getting paid for it. In the very first class at the New School, we're doing this. I brought in a Brahms string quartet. This kid sat down at the piano, and the string quartets with the alto clef and all the funny clefs. It was Brad Meldau. And he just sat down and kind of sight read this. So I said, if this is a typical student, my God. Well, that led to eventually teaching at Manhattan School of Music. And I took that course over there for graduate students. And I was there for about 10 years. I mean, on my epitaph, it should say, Loren Schoenberg, adjunct to the world, because I taught at every school, never full-time faculty, never health coverage or anything. But anyway, I taught there for a long time. And then at the same time, I had done radio. I had done college radio. And then I wound up kind of becoming a fill-in radio announcer at WBGO, because there was a show called Jazz from the Archives with Dan Morgenstern and Ed Berger and Vincent Pilote. And I was kind of like an unadopted son or something. So I started doing these shows with them. No money, but a lot of fun, and interviewing people, but doing a lot of historical shows. And that led to Kenny Washington was hired by Sirius Satellite Radio to take over all their jazz programming in the early days of satellite radio. So Kenny, this is another untold story, but he did such a job of digitizing thousands of pieces of swing era jazz and 50s era jazz too. And he created a database. This is before people knew what they were doing. He didn't do it himself, but he dictated to a computer guy at Sirius to have the computer program music based on an algorithm of tempo, key, if it modulates, major, minor, big band, small band. So you press a button, and you got the greatest sets of music you ever heard in your life, with all this all these weird juxtapositions, but that made for great changes of tempo and key all the time. So I was doing that. And you asked a question about the Jazz Museum, and we're just going to get there now.
Okay.
So, put it all together. So I was teaching at Manhattan, doing the Sirius Satellite Radio show. Juilliard was just about to start a jazz program, and I was going to teach there. And in 1997, I became Bobby Short's musical director. So Bobby had a trio for many, many years, famously at the Cafe Carlyle. And we were in the wings once at Jazz Lincoln Center on a benefit concert. We're both appearing. And I jokingly said, because I knew him through a woman named Jean Bach, and they were very good friends. And so I got to see that world, which is another world. And I said to Bobby, and jokingly, I said, hey, man, I said, you know what you need. You need a big band. I said, like I did for, I said, you're joking, a big band with Bobby Short. Well, I got a phone call from him about 6 months later saying, you mentioned a band, and, I can't afford a big band. I said, well, I was just joking, Bobby. Jesus, what? He said, well, I'll tell you what, I have one gig, at some hotel, not the Carlisle, but like a one night off gig, and I have some charts, and I've never really heard them. Would you so I put together 6 horns, 2 trumpets, a trombone, and 3 reeds. And we did this gig at some hotel here in Midtown, and the arrangements were really cheesy. They were really like what you would call hotel band arrangements. A lot of, a lot of whole notes, and the harmonies were just all pudding or, vanilla, oatmeal, or whatever you call it. Nothing really there, but it sounded good. They were good arrangements. And that was that. And then he called back and said, I'm going into the Carlisle in the fall, and I think I'd like to try the band for 10 weeks. 5 nights a week.
5 nights a week?
5 nights a week, 10 weeks, and I'd like to try it, but I'm going to need some arrangements because those arrangements I have are really pedestrian. So I started to arrange for the band, and pretty soon found that there were people who could do it better than I could, but that came a little bit later. So I put together a band, and the band was John Eckert and Virgil Jones, 2 trumpets. The trombone was split 50-50 between Eddie Burt and Bobby Pring. And the saxophones were myself, Scott Robinson, and Jack Stuckey or Jay Branford. And we joined Bobby's trio. He had a bass and drum. And it went well, although something funny happened. Bobby used to do a great version of On the Street of Dreams. And he asked me to write an arrangement. So I listened to his record, and this was part of why I eventually hired other arrangers. I didn't realize it, but I think subconsciously I was trying to educate him, but I was trying to write a sophisticated arrangement, a little beyond what he was doing at the piano, and it was a big error, but I didn't know it. So I wrote this esoteric arrangement. It wasn't bad, but it wasn't as good as the stuff that came later. So we did it. Now the funny thing was, at the Carlisle, the first season we were there, I didn't know it. The brass was here, then there was Bobby and the piano, and over on the other side of the bass, on the other side of the room, were the 3 reeds. So I wrote an arrangement of Street of Dreams with the bass clarinet and trombone, muted trombone, playing some kind of esoteric counterline to Bobby in some kind of harmony. It sounded like if Anton Webern, was sick and incapacitated. It was horrible, atonal, without the other note. So all the people sitting on one side of the other room just heard like, it was horrible. Well, they changed the configuration of the band. We eventually all sat together. And then Mark Lopeman and James Chirillo and Mike Christensen started writing stuff. And what would happen was, I go to Bobby's apartment, and he's never really gotten his due because he was a great pianist. People say, oh, he rushed or he didn't have a jazz feel. Who cares what he did? He was brilliant orchestrator. Monk, you would love this. He could sit down, if you could ask him to play a tune he hadn't played in 30 years. Sit down, he'd play, he'd find his key, and what would come out of the piano would sound like a Billy Strayhorn arrangement. I mean, he spontaneously could do that. I mean, and he loved Ellington. I mean, that was his whole life, was Ivy Anderson and Duke Ellington and Billy Strayhorn. He grew up with, he knew them, he knew Ivy Anderson, and he could just create these things. I mean, amazing. I would sit sometimes at the Carlisle, and we'd be playing an arrangement. Okay, so what would happen was eventually Mark Lopeman and James began to realize, because I would go to Bobby's house and record him playing. We would talk about the key and the tempo and what he wanted, and then we'd arrange, and I'd record it, and I'd give a copy of the recording to Mark or to James. And they started telling me, you know what? Everything in the arrangement is in the piano. See, I was adding things. Uh-huh. You don't need to add anything. Orchestrate the piano, and you can add a few notes, but that's the arrangement. You couldn't come up with something better. So we started playing these arrangements at the Carlisle, and I'm sitting like this, and I'm sitting on a banquette, and Bobby is facing that way at the piano. I'm facing him, and he's playing like this, and I'm watching him. We wound up doing I wound up doing 1,000 one-hour shows with him. It was 20 weeks a year for 5 years. So that's
wow.
20 weeks. Anyway, it was 1,000 shows because there were 2 shows a night, and he started playing on the piano, counterpoint to the arrangement that was written of his piano playing, and he could create 2 and 3 levels of counterpoint at the piano. It was not comping like D flat 7, C minor. It was counterpoint, and he had like this pearly upper register, and then he had like this middle thing, and then he had these strange bass notes, and I'd be listening when I wasn't playing. I said, oh, Jesus, what is he doing? He has 3 lines. It's almost like the way that Teddy Wilson played with the Benny Goodman Trio and Quartet. Mm. And Teddy Wilson's son once said to me, he said, Benny Goodman should have paid my father triple scale.
Yeah.
And I said, why? Because he has 3 things going on at the piano. He has a left hand, he has a right hand, and he has his thumb. There's 3 levels of stuff going on. Well, anyway, now, so I had all that stuff was going on, and that was, this incredibly rich part of my life. I mean, rich in terms of experience. And it was really great, but it was really too much. But I was handling it. I was in my early 40s. Through the Smithsonian Jazz Orchestra and one of the lesser bands I played in, I got to know a wonderful classical clarinetist in New York named Paul Garment. And Paul's father was Leonard Garment. And I knew who Len Garment was because he was a fascinating guy. I mean, he was known for being counsel to the president during Watergate. He was Nixon's lawyer, which I can explain. But he was a Brooklyn liberal guy who wound up in the Nixon White House and became a real, I guess what you call eminence grise in Washington in the 70s. He worked with Pat Moynihan at the UN and was a real culturally, he loved culture. And through the mechanisms of Washington and politics and lobbying and politics, he wound up doing a lot of great things. The National Endowments of the Arts and Humanities, which were created during the Nixon administration, during the Johnson administration, they were very small. When Nixon got into power, he brought Len Garment with him. Len became like the arts czar in the Nixon years. And he hired a woman named Nancy Hanks. It was under Nancy Hanks that the endowments went from, a few $100,000 or several $100,000 to gazillions of tens of millions.
Yes.
That was Len.
Okay.
Also the Duke Ellington birthday party. So a lot of great things happened with Len. Len had a great sense of humor. He was tagged with going out to solve the problem at Wounded Knee with Russell Means and the Native Americans. He met the chief of the Sioux Nation, at which he famously said, "That's funny, you don't look Sioux-ish." But anyway, he had a great sense of humor. And they laughed when he said it. Well, anyway, Len had the idea to build a National Jazz Museum a National Jazz Museum. So we got some money from friends in Washington who loved jazz, and they raised a few $100,000 and said, okay, we're going to hire someone up in New York, up in Harlem, and we're going to somehow get this jazz museum going. Well, I heard about this. I knew Len, and I hadn't been invited to participate, and that's okay. But I heard about it from Stanley Crouch. I heard about it from, I don't know, any number of people I knew saying, man, we had a meeting at this jazz museum. And okay, great. Well, to make a long story slightly less long, that version of the Jazz Museum just died. The guy who was leading it, this death by 1,000 blows of a 501c3. This consultant, this. And next thing you know, the money was gone. They hadn't raised any money, and the project died.
Okay.
So I knew Len, and when he would come to New York, we'd meet and just listen to him talk all his great stories. He wrote a wonderful book, by the way, called Crazy Rhythm, which Saul Bellow wrote a wonderful little blurb on. I strongly recommend it. Anyway, I met with him at the Carlisle once before going to work with Bobby that night. And he said, this Jazz Museum thing, he said, it died, but we just got $1 million from Congress, from Ted Stevens. He was head of appropriations. And we don't have an organization. I don't know what to do. Could you recommend someone who could take this on, And it wound up that I said, well, I'll try it. He says, well, you can't do it. You're doing all these other things. You don't have time. And I said, well, I'd like to try. So in May 2001, we opened up our offices, or was it late 2001? Or in 2000, right around 9/11 was when this all came together. And then early 2002, okay, the $1 million, and I want to say, in context, $1 million, of course, is a huge amount of money. In terms of building a 501c3 and creating an organization in New York City, it's like $10, and that's a crazy thing to say, but that's the truth. I mean, if you're looking at something major.
Yeah.
Plus, the money came with all kinds of restrictions. Couldn't use it for fundraising. Could only use it for the salaries and for research and stuff like that. Well, opened up an office in Harlem, and we decided that we needed to aim big. So the genius, the great quality that Len had at that time was, even though we had nothing to show except a desk and a telephone and a board of directors or something like that, he said, you know what? We're going to shoot big. We're going to build a big museum, and we're going to hire the best people. And even though we didn't have the money to do that, because this $1 million, trust me, was going, it was going with this and with that. We're going to hire the best people. And so we had articles in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal because of who Len Garment was. for the great aspirations of this organization. And so let me think of how I can collapse this so it makes sense. I brought Wynton Marsalis and Ken Burns on board. I'd been working with Wynton at Jazz Lincoln Center just as a consultant or as an educator, and I had participated as one of the consultants on the Ken Burns Jazz series. So they agreed to join the board, even though we didn't have anything. And it was a great thing for Wynton because, of course, he has his own organization that he has to raise money for. So people started saying, well, you've got these great plans. I had written the NPR Curious Listener's Guide to Jazz in 2001. We took that book and, with a lot of other opinions, created an exhibit model for the museum, for a 50,000 square foot museum. We hired a guy named Ralph Applebaum, who designed the Clinton Library and the Civil Rights Museum, and paid him a huge chunk of that money that we had gotten, and spent 2 years designing what a 50,000 square foot museum would look like. The exhibits, this, who would be in the exhibits, all the interstitial stuff and all this kind of stuff. In the meantime, people started saying, but what are you actually doing? You're planning, but what the hell are you doing? I can't give money to an organization that's planning to be big someday. So we started doing public programming. And that became the tail that wagged the dog, or whatever that expression is. It just started almost as an afterthought. And it became who we are and who we still are. Oral histories, hundreds of them. With, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar or Bobby Short or Roy Haynes or Clark Terry or Chico Hamilton or Billy Taylor just name all the people, but also significantly the lesser known people.
Yeah, that's important.
And not only the lesser known jazz people, of whom we interviewed more than not, but also people on the periphery of jazz, architects, newspaper columnists, doctors, people who had a fascinating jazz story to tell. And we did these in public, in our little office. We had one room in our office. And so we started to establish a reputation. And out of that came all the other programs, Jazz for Curious Listeners and Jazz for Curious Readers, and I can't even remember them all. And then we started producing a concert series at the Rubin Museum of Art called Harlem in the Himalayas, because the Rubin Museum of Art is dedicated to the culture of the Himalayas. And
I wondered about that.
Yeah.
You told me that.
Well, the way it happened was there was a man named Donald Rubin who made a lot of money in health insurance, and he had more money than he knew what to do with. And he was nuts about it. He was dedicated to Himalayan and culture and spirituality. So he built this vanity museum down on 18th Street, I believe it is, off of 7th Avenue, and he hired all the right people and got a brilliant programmer and a brilliant designer, and his vanity project wound up becoming one of the hippest, smartest, most popular museums in Manhattan. Who'd have thought that it might happen? So I went down to meet him because Len had met him at the urologist's office, and started to pitch a program to him, and he said, what should we call it? And I said, Harlem in the Himalayas. And he said, what does that mean? I said, I have no idea. And this program went on for several years, won some awards for best programming, and I'm proud of it. If you look at, we must have done 150 concerts or something like that. And the idea was that whoever came down, whether it was Dizzy Reese or whether it was Jack Walrath or whether it was, I can't even start to name the names, all kinds of young contemporary musicians and famous people from other countries. The idea was that one of the tunes that you played would relate to the Himalayan exhibits in the museum. Either you'd write a tune. I remember one guy came in and played Caravan, but that was a one-off. That never happened again. Yeah. But or as Kenny DeVerne used to say, Caravan. Did you interview him?
Yes, indeed.
Boy, do I miss him, but I wish he
really
was around. But
best.
anyway, Kenny told me, he said one time he was on one of those jazz cruises, and they told the band, you'll eat with the customers, everything. Well, of course, every time they went to eat in the restaurant, they never got called. Their table never got called. And so there he is with all these great guys, and they're just ignoring him. So he told me, he says, man, I went up to the microphone, to announce. I said, Christ, party of 12. Anyway, so the Rubin Museum of Art, and that's pretty much it. So the museum slowly grew. Great. I mean, for a long time it was just me and one other person, and then two other people.
Yeah.
And then eventually we got to the point, where I had 3 people. And then eventually we got to the point where I realized that I was not the right person anymore. I mean, writing the checks and opening the door and putting up the chairs and at some point, like, we really needed, especially if we wanted to go to the next level of development and raising money, it wasn't enough to say, oh, isn't this wonderful? There's 2 people, and boy, they do everything. And who wants to give real money to that? So the board and I decided that, it was time to really hire an administrative staff. And now we have a full-time staff of 4 or 5, a great administrator, a lot of consultants.
Great.
And artistic directors are John Batiste and Christian McBride. And we're about to enter our 3rd decade.
In a new building, right?
We moved to a new building
Yeah.
about 2.5 years ago.
Yep.
And it's spanking new and great. We just have a large 1 room.
Mm-hmm.
But we have some great collections. We have Ralph Ellison's, the recordings that he listened to when he was writing Invisible Man.
Wow.
We have that. We have Eddie Lockjaw Davis's tenor sax, and I went out to his family's house in Las Vegas, all his things. So his reeds and his matchbook covers from Birdland and the album that his mother made when he was a kid.
Wow.
We have the Savory collection, which are unissued recordings going back to 1930s and 40s. We have a handful of collections like that are very, very special. And
so
that's
I'm
it.
going to make a proposal that when I do part 2 with you,
Wow.
I'll come down.
We'll do it
and
there.
We'll do it there.
Oh, I'd love to have
And
you.
the aura would be there, and I'll get to see your things. And
Yeah. Well, only on one condition.
Yeah.
If I can interview you for our archives.
Okay.
Because your archive is unique. And as I told you before we filmed, and I think it's the second time I'm using the word unctuous, but I'm not trying to be unctuous. But, what you've done consistently for a quarter of a century is invaluable and unique. There are other archives or other interviews, and we all know them. But you have created a finite thing based on what seems to be like your personal thing with the people that you interview somehow. And I don't know how, some of them I can tell you're friends with. And some maybe you never met before. But they're informal. And like I told you recently, Buddy DeFranco. I went back and just started checking out some of your, and as soon as I started checking out your Buddy DeFranco interview, it sent me to 15 records of his and other things. And then he talked about this, and then so-and-so. He said, well, it's funny, when we had, whomever here, he mentioned something, but then I go and watch that one. And, I'm looking forward to, your interviews being placed at some place where they'll be accessible. Well, they are accessible.
They are on YouTube now.
Absolutely, but even beyond YouTube.
Yeah.
Because it's a unique thing, and it was an inspiration to part of what we did with our project.
Well, I appreciate
And we look at ours as kind of complementary to yours.
Yeah.
And so if I can interview you, then I'll do another one.
Okay. Sounds like a plan.
Okay.
And I'm glad to have you part of ours.
Oh,
So thank you.
I'm really happy to be part of it.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right.